All right, next is the fiscal 2018, if you can imagine, budget that Mr. Giuliani is going to kick off.
The mere mention of the word budget in the agenda.
Yeah, the room is markedly emptier than it was a few minutes ago.
Die-hard budget fans.
I don't think they're just gonna do this and they're gonna maybe combine
Go
it.
back to that. Oh, I see.
See, I just can't believe we're in 2018.
I hope you're all comfortable,
Oh, my God.
and you brought your pillows.
I need to keep them. Or a blanket.
I don't think I need the stool.
That's right.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's time to present the 2017-18 tentative budget, which the board will be adopting this evening. I'd like to start out by reiterating one of the things that Dr. Valesky mentioned in his superintendent's report, and that is the Certificate of Excellence in Financial Reporting. This is the fourth consecutive year for the district having received this award. And in addition to this award, recently the district received a similar award from the Government Finance Officers Association. I think that these two awards are a testament to the level of attention and fiscal responsibility that the board supports and we endeavor to pursue throughout the course of each year. And I do want to thank Mr. Crotchfeld and Ms. Rosenving and the entire finance staff for their hard work in making that possible. Moody's Investor Service annually assesses or periodically assesses the district and all districts and governmental entities and so forth regarding their financial stability. February 1, 2017, Moody's issued its annual comments on East Brunswick Public Schools. And I highlighted a few of the comments that Moody's made on behalf of the district. East Brunswick Public Schools' credit position is very strong, and its AA2 rating slightly exceeds the U.S. school district median of AA3. With regard to debt, East Brunswick Public Schools' net direct debt to full value at 1.4% is slightly lower than the U.S. median. With regard to finances, the financial position of East Brunswick Public Schools is healthy overall and slightly favorable to its AA2 rating. In management and governance, balanced financial operations are a sign of sound financial management. In this case, East Brunswick Public Schools approximately broke even, whereas the tax base generally contracted. Now, in the world of finance, these are accolades. Finance folks, accountants, auditors do not embellish comments in a way that might be seen in other areas. This is exceptional for the district, and we have constantly maintained this level of performance, and it affects our ratings when it's time to borrow money. It results in lower interest rates in comparison to what others might be able to obtain, and ultimately that is a benefit to the taxpayer whenever we go out for bonded debt. I thought it was important to note this before we really get into the balance of the budget. So now moving on. Factors impacting the bottom line. Back in January, when we started having conversations regarding the budget, I noted that there are some broad areas regarding the factors that would affect bottom line. State aid, of course, the fact that we're working with a 2% base cap on the tax levy, our budgeted fund balance, the amount that we would generate out of the current year to be able to help sustain the subsequent year's budget. And when I say generate, that would be monies that would remain unspent to support next year's budget. And enterprise operations. We utilize our enterprise operations to be able to provide a revenue stream to the general fund budget. It helps support our programs and provides an offset to what might otherwise have to be raised through other taxes or even to offset the potential loss of program. And let me back up to that for a moment. I think one of the things that's really key here that has impacted our bottom line for the next year's budget is the fact that with regard to federal funds, which have a substantial impact on our budget, the state has directed that we budget at an 80% level of the current year. Now that is for IDEA funding and for Title I. That translates into a $415,000 lesser amount based on what our current year award was in both of those programs. That's quite substantial. Earmark that, $415,000, and you'll see impact as we move forward. On state aid, just a quick comparison from where we were to where we are. Back in 2008, 2009, that was the last year that we received state aid in excess of $20 million. The subsequent year, we had substantial reductions in our state aid, which brought us down to $17.6 million. And that is the same year in which the district was forced to have to undertake the costs associated with charter school in town. So there was a significant impact to our budget, loss of program, loss of staff. Since 2009, 2010, you see where those incremental increases have been, and they've been few and far between and minimal at best. Current year, we were at 17.9, almost $18 million, and that amount will remain static for next year. When we talk about, or when you hear that state aid is flat, or that funding is flat, the reality is that it's not. Costs go up, and the ratio of state aid to our overall budget continually decreases year after year. And that means that the burden is placed more and more on the local taxpayer. On the expenditure side, with regard to factors that are impacting the bottom line, expenditures. Certainly, our goal is continuation of high-quality educational services. That's key. We've had some unanticipated services, staffing, and tuition that have affected the current year budget that ultimately roll into next year. That becomes a factor that we have to contend with in balancing the budget. Health benefit costs. Health benefit costs are in the range of about 7.8% at this point in time, looking forward to next year. We're hoping that will mitigate itself in the next month or two as we continue on through the budget process, but there's no guarantees. Currently, we are looking at about a 7.8% increase in health benefit costs. Collective bargaining, our obligations under our contracts with our bargaining units, and certainly charter school costs, which again will be increasing for next year. The other factor that comes into play is the shrinking enrollment. We've been having a shrinking enrollment from year to year. Our demographer had projected that. It is coming true, and we're seeing losses across the board with regard to where our enrollments are, and that does impact staffing down the road. So I think a little bit of background is important to get to where we are now. And so these are some conversations we've had with the Finance Committee. I think it's important to help gain an understanding of the road to the recommendations in the tentative budget. As of March 10th, now remember, we've been working on this budget consistently since the fall. As of March 10th, our estimated revenue was at $148.8 million. Our appropriations were at $151.2 million. We were looking at a shortfall of approximately $2.4 million. That's a gap that had to be bridged because the district must present a balanced budget in revenue and appropriations. So I think it's important to note some selected items in terms of what has grown on the appropriations side. So when we look at salary, salary overall is increasing by approximately 2.34%. $1.5 million in base. That is net of breakage. So in other words, any retirees that we are expecting, that we know will be leaving, we adjust the salaries for the replacements, knowing that the salary will be less. It reflects the Title I reduction that I spoke about a few minutes ago. We have new special education positions presented in the tentative budget that are necessary to continue to provide services to our students. And then the impact of unanticipated positions in the current year that affected not only this year, but will move forward to next year as well. In health benefits, this is showing a net of 7.28% increase. We have a 1.2, almost a $1.3 million increase in health benefits, not including the health benefits associated with the new teaching positions and support positions in special education. Special education tuition is rising from the current year's budget to next year by 37.49%. This is comprised of the base tuition increases that we will see because of the anticipated rates. Many of the rates we've already gotten, so we can project $447,000. IDEA reduction of $350,000. And unanticipated special education tuition for the current year that was not budgeted and could not be budgeted of $178,000. Now, it's important to note with special ed tuition that we are not permitted to have a reserve for special education tuition. We must budget exactly for those students that we know we will be servicing. So one of the things that we do with the special ed department is we look at any students that are aging out, we deduct those, but anyone that we know will continue in programs, we maintain those. But we cannot buffer our estimates with unknown students. Continuing on in extraordinary services, and these services would be those for our neediest children who would require, for example, one-to-one aid or one-to-one nursing services. Those are extraordinary services. Those services will be going up, are anticipated to go up almost 20%, comprised of a $139,000 increase moving forward to next year, plus $129,000, almost $130,000 that we were contracting in this year that were not anticipated, that could not be planned. Pupil transportation services on contracted services, just as a point of measure. Fuel to operate our buses, not very significant in terms of the balance of what I've talked about, but I think it was important to note that we have other costs as well. Our charter school payments will go up by almost $110,000. This is a net amount. Hatikva's overall payments will be going up more than this, but we had students attending a couple of other smaller charter schools. There may have been 2 or 3 students, and they're no longer attending those schools, so the net increase is approximately $110,000.
Could you explain what you mean by the Hatikva payments going up, what the impact is?
The impact in terms of the Hatikva itself?
Yes, the budget impact.
Overall, the charges to Hatikva will be approximately $2.7 million for next year.
That's off our budget.
Off our budget, yes. And I'll be talking about that a little bit further. We are an employer, and so as an employer, we pay FICA taxes. And our FICA at this point in time is also increasing by about $105,000. So when we look at our overall appropriations growth on these selected items, we're almost at $5 million, a 4.16% increase. in comparison to our estimated revenue growth, tax levy, which is capped at 2%, at $2.4 million. Our shortfall, based on those selected items, is about $2.5 million. Now, a few slides back, I talked about what our budget development shortfall was March 10th, and you can see how closely aligned the selected items are to the overall budget shortfall. It's kind of a reconciliation and gives you a scope of where we're incurring the costs. So bridging the budget gap. Lease purchase financing. Now, we did as much as possible to not impact education, not impact the program. So lease purchase financing. The Warnsdorfer roof replacement, we had allotted funds for that in next year's budget. Unfortunately, to bridge that $2.4 million gap, we could not keep those funds in there. However, the planning for that replacement will continue this year, and in the next budget cycle, we will have an expiring lease purchase payment that will be renewed and will provide the resources to undertake that project. Now, this project was not going to take place this summer. There simply was not enough planning time. So it will happen on the schedule that we anticipated. It's just that the funding source has shifted from the fiscal 18 budget. It will shift over to the fiscal 19 budget. And that's the best thing that we can do at this point. IDA and Title I funding, I already mentioned, $415,000 of a loss. How do we bridge that gap? Well, it's a little bit of a calculated risk. We're not sure that it will be an 80% funding level. It could be 90, it could be 95. We just don't know. And the state has never been fully accurate with providing us that kind of information. So we've mitigated that by projecting that the reduction will be at 90% level of funding rather than at 80. So that provides us a little bit of a buffer. We'll have to watch that over the next couple of months before we get to final. Exit payments. These are payments that are made to retiring staff for the contractual rights to vacation time, sick leave time, pursuant to bargaining agreements. We've projected what those are. We've been able to cut those back. Unemployment compensation reserve. Again, looking at what our costs have been, we felt that we were able to trim that back in order to be able to help bridge the gap. And health benefits, anticipating that we might see, I think our claims history, and it's all driven by our claims history. Claims history has been very good. We could see some additional reduction coming out of that, and so we've taken an offset for that as well. But that's not enough. On the estimated revenue side, we've taken a hard look at tuition coming in from other districts, and we've received a number of students that have been placed here through the state DCP&P. Those are tuition students where other districts are paying for those students to attend the schools. So we calculated what that tuition would be, and we've taken full credit for that. Performing Arts Center equity transfer. With the restructuring of the Performing Arts Center management and bookings and so forth, we were able to project out, based on what we know our contracts are and our net income would be, what that transfer would be. So we're looking at about a $350,000 net coming out of the Performing Arts Center to help offset the budget. The Early Learning Academy equity transfer for additional sections. We will be going down in elementary sections because of enrollment. So that opens up classrooms. That allows us to add at least 2 sections of the ELA program. And that equity that we anticipate, because there's been a waiting list for folks to come onto the program, that net equity would amount to about $50,000. And even that wasn't enough.
And Bernie, that's a total of 2 classrooms or
Two.
2 classrooms per site?
Just two classrooms. It would be, I think it's going well beyond what we can forecast
Just pretty
to
much.
count on many sections more. I think 2 sections is absolutely doable based on the data and does not overextend us at all. I think it's a reasonable number. I'd be hesitant on doing more than that at this time. So even those first few items is not sufficient to bridge the budget. Because of the growth in health benefits, it triggers a health benefit tax cap adjustment of approximately $407,000. We had no choice but to also include that. That means instead of the 2% tax levy, it would be 2.33 on the general fund budget. Now, I'll talk further about that because there is offsetting tax reductions that will bring that down. But it's important to note that this is a key component to the overall budget. And this is the last piece with regard to bridging the budget gap. We are projecting reduction in force of 6.5 full-time equivalent support staff, not affecting instruction, classroom support. This is outside of that. But we could not bridge the gap without this. And in terms of the staffing requests that were made, the special education department went back, took a harder look at its numbers, I should say, and was able to trim back 1 resource room teacher requested from a full-time to a half-time. That saved half a salary and the benefits associated with the position. So where are we? The estimated revenue and appropriations are now in balance. We're looking at a general fund tax increase of approximately $2.8 million, and our debt service fund tax, that's the debt service fund, which is what pays our mortgages for bonded debt, is going down. So the difference, the net impact of the two, is a net tax increase of $2.2 million or 1.73%, which nets out to less than the state cap on the base tax. What do we have in the tentative budget? Certainly, support and improve the instructional programs, our co-curricular and athletic activities, curriculum improvements, technology investment. And I think it's important to note that in this particular segment, I want to highlight the fact that we've been responsive to the community with regard to the feedback that was received during last year's strategic planning process. So this budget does include adjustments to program, co-curricular, extracurricular activities as the community asked. In terms of staffing, for teaching and support staff, world languages will have 2 Mandarin teachers, the introduction of a new program. Those 2 positions are offset by 2 Spanish teaching positions that will not be filled. So that is a net, but this is a new program going into the next budget. In special ed, an LLD teacher and an instructional assistant for an additional section that is required. 1/2 of a resource teaching position. A new section for autism requiring 1 teacher and 1 instructional assistant. Club advisors, again in response to the community. There'll be 16 additional clubs at the elementary level 5 at Hammersholt, 2 at Churchill, and 2 at the high school. In athletics, 8th grade baseball will be introduced. And we'll be centralizing our registrar functions. Instead of having 11 separate registration processes in the district with 11 ways of doing things, we'll be centralizing that process, bringing that to one location, and that will be offset by the reallocation of an existing staff member. This is budget neutral, but it bears mentioning and is reflected in the budget. And lastly, with the changes in our enrollments at the elementary level, there will be 9 sections that will be reduced. All of those grades remain within the board's standards by policy for class size. We will be watching this each month over the next couple of months to see if it needs to be tweaked. But at this point in time, this is the way that we have to go, and really, it doesn't make any sense not to do this. There are ebbs and flows that happen with budgets. So, Mrs.
Can
Lax.
you remind me the maximum number of students per class that we?
25 is where we start to look at changing into a new section. So 24 is the max we want to have in a classroom.
Okay, so moving on. In curriculum and instruction, I mentioned the implementation of the Chinese language program. The budget includes music technology equipment, nonfiction texts, an investment in science for the elementary schools, an Explore Learning Gizmos laboratory simulation software package. I believe that's for Churchill. Humanities readers, textbooks for marine biology, academic physics, honors chemistry, intro to business, intro to marketing, and math in sports. Some equipment, a laser cutter, percussion equipment, concert basses, and the replacement of band uniforms that are about 20 years old now.
Bernie, before you move on, the inclusion of some of the textbooks that were on the previous screen, are some of those just classroom sets, or are we intending to purchase texts for every student that's enrolled in those particular classes?
These are classroom sets. Mrs. Gulick, is that correct?
Some of the electives are classroom
Yeah.
sets.
But there's a significant investment in textbooks. And I'll tell you that in spite of the bridging the gap on this budget, that curriculum and instruction, the support for instruction, textbooks, supplies, materials, that has not given way to the kinds of reductions we've had to make elsewhere. The level of requests that had been approved in the current fiscal year is approximately the same, if not more, for the next fiscal year. So we always look at that, because when you get down to the bottom line, those additional requests that come out of curriculum and instruction they really pale in comparison to the overall growth in other areas of the budget. So we make sure that we maintain that level of investment in the program. Okay, moving on. Some comparative information. Charter school payments. So here, I thought you'd like some graphics for a change instead of just words. So here we go. Charter school payments over the last 3 years. So fiscal 2016, 17, and then looking at next year. We had $2.2 million in fiscal 2016 that was expended. $2.6 million budgeted in the current year, $2.7 budgeted for next year in charter school. And once again, anything that we have in the budget for charter school is paid for by the community. It comes off of our tax levy, and we have an obligation to pay it. There are no choices in this. The state tells us what we must do. They give us a schedule of payments, and that's pretty much it. This is and actually I'd like to point out the fact that this $2.7 million, had it not been there, is about the amount of the bridge that we had to close, or the gap that we had to close.
Sir Giuliano, can I just interject for
Yes.
1 second? So on your slide for charter school payments, I'm going to make an appeal here to the public, anybody who watches this. If you have neighbors who are going to be new to the community and are going to look at Hatikva, look at us first. You need to look at East Brunswick Public Schools to look for a value in public education that cannot be duplicated by anybody else. And so we're going to have to market ourselves at every opportunity to stop this from continuing to grow. It's clear the state is going to approve expansion of seats, and my job is to try to convince people that their students need to be right here in East Brunswick Public Schools. Thanks.
In our regular education programs, pre-K to 12 instruction. So we've got this broken down on preschool in the first batch, kindergarten, then grades 1 to 5, 6 through 8, 9 through 12, and then regular undistributed instruction. Now, this is how the state requires us to budget, so we're presenting in the same way that we are required to budget. And each of the 3 years are being presented for fiscal 2016, 17, and 18. The level of support has been consistent across the board. Any increases that you see with regard to the instructional programs at the grade levels, and that is strictly salary, that is pursuant to contract requirements. There's a slight dip that you see in the grade 1 to 5 category. That is a combination of the reductions for the 9 sections. And also, across the board, what this reflects is what I mentioned early on with regard to breakage. We anticipate that based on the notices we've received for retirement, we do not budget at the higher level of salary. We take the difference out and budget at a newly incoming teacher level. Co-curricular activities and athletics. The last 2 years have been relatively steady in terms of level of spending, about $330, $350 million for co-curricular, and $760,000 to $800,000 on the athletics. We're seeing a little bump for next year, and that is, again, in response to the community and what feedback we had gotten at strategic planning. So looking at the projected year, we're at about $394,000 for co-curricular and $900,000 for athletics. Media centers and instructional staff training. These levels have remained pretty consistent as well. Media center expenditures over the last 3 years, last year, this year, and looking into next year, is remaining at about $1.3 million. And instructional staff training was at $1.4 million in 2016 and budgeted at $1.5 million this year and next year. Guidance and student assistance. There was a slight bump last year, or I should say in fiscal 2017 over the prior year, because the board made a decision to implement some additional guidance counselors. So that's reflected here for the 2017 year. Looking forward, we are a little bit less than where we were, and that's attributable to some realignment of staff. The the child study team levels of expenditure and budget are consistent in each of the years at $2.9 million. Special education tuition. So I mentioned this early on. So to put into perspective in terms of the chart here and the dollars, For 2016, we spent $2.4 million in special education tuition. The current year, with the adjustment that was made for the unanticipated out-of-district placements, we're at $2.6 million. And going into 2018, with the projected increases that come from the state or the out-of-district placements that give us their estimated tuition rates, so these are not made up, they're not contrived, $3.2 million. Continuing on with special education services for program and instruction, the first set of bars reflect our in-district, self-contained, and resource room programs. The next set for basic skills instruction, we're seeing a slight decrease going into next year, and that is directly attributable to a couple of things. One is Title I funding reduction, and also two basic skills staff being reduced at the middle school level. And bilingual instruction will remain relatively static moving forward. Speech, OTP, and related services, that's identified in the blue bars, and extraordinary services in the brown. And so speech and OTP and related services have been consistent in each of the years. We started with a $2.5 million expenditure last year. Current year budgeted at $2.5 million, going to about $2.6 million last year. Extraordinary services, on the other hand, has grown. We spent $2 million last year in extraordinary services. This year's obligations, as of the time we struck this budget, we're at $3 million. Moving into next year, they are projected at $3.2 million.
Bernie, excuse me, what can we expect in terms of extraordinary aid to help meet the cost of these extraordinary services?
$500,000, and that's already budgeted on the revenue side. To anticipate more than that would be really taking an excess risk that we just don't know what will happen.
Right.
It just changes from year to year. Okay. Key budget dates. Well, tonight the board will be adopting, we hope, a tentative budget. It's required by law. We don't do it tonight, we have to do it by Monday at the latest. Public hearing will be held April 27th. Final budget adoption May 11th. So we have time to vet this further. This is not written in stone. Let's ask questions, let's have conversations, and we'll look at the data over the next 2 months to see if we can mitigate any of the decisions that have had to be made in crafting this tentative budget. Budget information, we'll be posting the budget online at our website, and if anyone is inclined to actually look at a paper document, we'll have a budget book available in the office of the school business administrator.
Thanks. Question? Mrs. Shaw.
Although despite some pretty bad news in this budget, I'm still feeling pretty confident that we will have the support of the community because the total increase is coming in under the 2% cap. However, I do wonder if, presented with the information that you gave us this evening, whether our community would feel so strongly about the additional clubs and additional stipends for athletic activities. We really don't have any way of gauging that at this point, except to perhaps hear from the public as to whether or not they consider those items to be as important as they did 14 months ago.
And the opportunity will be there at the public hearing. That's why we have a public hearing, to receive comment. and the public hearing is not held the same night of the final adoption.
Right.
So we'll be able to take input. The board will be able to have its conversations between now and then as well, and we'll make decisions accordingly.
And overall, before we move on, the tax impact is 11 cents, I believe.
I didn't memorize what that is. It is in
Oh,
the
that's an
budget books that
important
you
one.
have.
Yes.
And I'm going to take my seat now so I have reference documents.
11.8. And that is on each $100 of assessed value.
100,000. No, 100.
Yeah. Okay. All right, well, I mean, I think as taxpayers, we never want to see it go up even that much, but I think that considering the unexpected expenses and the fact that many of our budget items were, in fact, encouraged by community members, it's not too bad.
Mrs. Decker?
Mayor, I think you bring up a good point, but I know it was it 14 months ago that we had the strategic planning committee with the community?
January of last year.
Yeah, but when I think, because I was on the extracurricular subcommittee, so I feel like those numbers are imprinted on my brain. There was such an overwhelming request for clubs, particularly at the elementary school, because back in that.
They've been cut so
Right, that
drastically.
2008, 2010, that two-year budget period, we cut so much, and it mostly came from Hammersholt. So the five we're putting back is still not where we were even, 7 years ago. Putting two back at each at the elementary school, again, I can remember a time when we had a lot more. Obviously, we can only do what we can do, but what I take comfort in is that there were such overwhelming numbers supporting this. It was really so important to the parents, and they seem to be very cognizant of when it was cut and why, which I thought was really interesting, which means they've been listening. So that's what makes me feel better about it.
Anyone else?
There's a lot of information to absorb.
Would you just explain what it means to adopt a tentative budget versus the other things we have going on until the end of the budget cycle?
Sure. So the tentative budget serves as a base point from which to have discussions on what the plan is for next year. This is one of the most important things that the board does, adopting a budget, because it is our roadmap for the next year. It guides us on what programs will be provided, what we can purchase and what we can't purchase, what services will be provided. And it also, under New Jersey law, we cannot expend above what the budget is. So we have to be pretty good at budgeting, at our estimates and salary and benefits and so forth. We will never budget or be able to budget at the exact amount that we spend. That's an impossibility. We need to have some buffer in there. But there's really very little buffer in here to be able to ensure that we can function and still deal with emergency issues that arise, unanticipated issues that arise, such as we had in the current year. So, this is the baseline. The board will continue with its conversations. Community input will be gotten in April. And ultimately, a final budget must be adopted in May. And that will then set what the roadmap is for the year beginning July 1.
Bernie, I think you brought up a really good point, that you made several references to things we were hoping would be offset, like our claims history. even the amount of money we spend on electricity, gas, it's really subject to the kind of winter we're going to have, which the weatherman can't even predict what's going to be in 2 hours. We can't possibly figure out a year from now what next winter is going to be like. So just in terms of the things we are anticipating, and when you talk about the state and federal government giving us a heads up, you better plan for 20% less in extraordinary aid. We know that means it's going to be even less than that. We know that we don't know who's going to be moving into the district. So there's so many unanticipated costs that we yet have to be prepared for. So I thought that was a really good point.
I just want the public to know how much work Mr. Juliana, Mr. Kroschfeld, the entire financial staff has put into this.
Oh, yeah.
When I talk about, hours and hours, days running to nights, all weekend long, looking at every single piece of documentation, trying to find every single element that we could look at to try to close this gap. I know once we started with that gap and the conversations continued just constantly about what ifing, and I really appreciate the professionalism and the work that was put in to developing this budget that really is a document that represents the needs of the community, the wishes of the Board of Education, and most importantly, provides a great education, continues to provide a great education for all of our students.
Well, also, lest we not forget each budget manager that presented to us.
Absolutely.
Knows their budget better than anybody, probably.
Yep.
And also, folks have to remember that certainly not every priority is granted, but the whole process of prioritizing what are going to be your most important asks and what won't is an incredibly difficult job, because you really have to put forth the justification for everything.
Right.
And they do it incredibly well, and they presented at each meeting, so we thank them all. We have some in the audience here too, but it's quite a process.
Everyone came with their A game this year,
Yeah.
so.